The rhythmic squeak of a mop across the shiny linoleum floor echoed through the empty halls of Maplewood High School. It was early, too early for any students to be roaming the corridors. The fluorescent lights flickered, as they always did at this time of day, casting long shadows down the wide, deserted hallway. At the far end of the hall, a figure worked steadily, her movements deliberate but weary. Sandra Milligan, a woman in her early 50s, pushed the mop across the floor with quiet determination. She wore her faded green janitor's uniform like armor, even though its sheen had long since worn off. Her hands, rough from years of labor, moved as though they were on autopilot, back and forth, back and forth. But her eyes told a different story. Behind the simple task of cleaning lay a deeper exhaustion, one that couldn't be mopped away. It lingered in the way her shoulders sagged and in the distant look she wore, as if she carried the weight of more than just a broom or a mop. Sandra had been at Maplewood for nearly 6 years now, and though she went about her job with quiet dignity, she was still an enigma to most. She didn't speak much, kept to herself, and never looked anyone in the eye for too long. The sound of footsteps broke the stillness, and Sandra looked up just as Abigail Carter, a student she had come to recognize, walked in from the main entrance. Abigail was early as usual, always neat and poised, her backpack slung over one shoulder and the same gentle smile on her face every morning. "Good morning, Miss Milligan," Abigail greeted cheerfully, her voice light and soft as she passed by. Sandra nodded, offering a half-smile in return. "Morning," she murmured, grateful for the brief connection. Abigail was always kind to her, never failing to offer a greeting or a smile. She was one of the few who saw her as more than just a janitor. Most of the other kids didn't even notice Sandra, or if they did, it was never in a good way. The hallway gradually began to fill with students, the noise level rising as lockers clanged open and shut, backpacks thudded against the floor, and laughter echoed off the walls. Sandra continued her work quietly, blending into the background as if she were part of the school itself. Yet she noticed everything: the groups of friends talking, the teachers hurrying past with their coffee mugs and papers, the looks some students gave her as they sidestepped her bucket. Some were indifferent, but others enjoyed making her work just a little harder. It wasn't uncommon for someone to spill their drink deliberately or drop trash. Just as she finished cleaning an area, Sandra sighed softly and focused on her task. She had learned not to let it bother her, but some days were harder than others. Abigail Carter wasn't like the others. Every day, without fail, she packed 2 lunches, one for herself and one for Sandra. It wasn't something she made a big deal of. She simply left the extra lunch bag on the janitor's cart with a quiet smile and walked away. At first, Sandra had been confused by the gesture, unsure of why Abigail would go out of her way to be kind to her. But over time, she grew accustomed to it and even looked forward to it. It was one of the few bright spots in her day. Though she would never admit it, today was no different. After dropping off her lunch, Abigail joined her friends at their lockers. Sandra glanced at the brown paper bag sitting on her cart and felt a warmth in her chest that she hadn't felt in years. She didn't get many kindnesses these days. Abigail, she thought, was too good for this world, too kind. The sort of kindness that didn't expect anything in return. As she continued down the hall, mopping the floors and tidying up after the students who hurried off to their first classes, she did her best to stay unnoticed, to blend into the background. The fewer eyes on her, the better. But she knew, deep down, that her very presence invited stares and whispers. Her age, her worn-out uniform, and her quiet demeanor were all marks that the students judged her by, even if they didn't say it aloud. She wasn't blind to the way they looked at her. She had heard them laughing behind her back, mocking her for the way she moved slowly down the halls, for her gray hair, for the life they assumed she had lived. To them, Sandra was just a janitor, an old woman who hadn't done anything with her life. They didn't know her story. They didn't know what she had sacrificed. All they saw was an older black woman who cleaned up after them. But Abigail saw more. The bell rang, signaling the start of first period, and the hallways emptied quickly. Sandra pushed her cart toward the faculty lounge, where she usually took her break. She sat down heavily in one of the chairs, grateful for the brief moment of peace, pulling out the lunch. Abigail had left her. Sandra smiled a little as she opened the bag, a turkey sandwich, an apple, and a small bottle of juice. Simple, but thoughtful. As she ate, her mind wandered. She didn't allow herself to think too much about the past. It was too painful. But sometimes, memories crept in uninvited. The sound of helicopters, the sharp crack of gunfire, the long, lonely nights overseas. She had been someone else then, someone strong, someone with purpose. Sandra sighed and rubbed her temples. That part of her life felt like another lifetime, one she barely recognized anymore. Abigail didn't know what had prompted her to start bringing extra lunches for Sandra. Maybe it was the way she carried herself quietly, with a sadness that tugged at Abigail's heart. Or maybe it was because no one else seemed to care. In the beginning, Abigail hadn't tried to talk to Sandra much. She just wanted to do something nice. But as the weeks went by, Abigail found herself wanting to know more about the woman behind the uniform. She wanted to understand the sadness she saw in Sandra's eyes every time they passed in the hall. One day during lunch, Abigail decided to approach Sandra while she was cleaning near the cafeteria. She walked over to the janitor's cart and sat down on a bench nearby, watching her for a moment before speaking. "Do you mind if I sit here?" Abigail asked, her voice soft. Sandra looked up, a little surprised, but shook her head. "No, I don't mind," she said almost quietly. There was a pause, and then Abigail, nervously fidgeting with her hands, asked, "You seem like you don't have many friends or family around here. Do you mind sharing your story with me?" Abigail's innocent question, delivered with a friendly tone, made Sandra hesitate. It wasn't something she had ever talked about, not to anyone, but there was something in Abigail's eyes, a genuine kindness that made Sandra feel safe, even if just for a moment. She sighed deeply, placing the mop back in the bucket and wiping her hands on a rag. "My story, it's not one I tell often," Sandra began, her voice low and hesitant. And then, with a heavy heart, she started to speak. Sandra's voice was soft, almost distant, as she began to recount her story. Abigail sat silently, her eyes fixed on the older woman, listening intently. "I wasn't always like this," Sandra said, gesturing to herself. "I wasn't always cleaning floors, taking orders, trying to blend into the background. Once upon a time, I wore a uniform I was proud of, the kind that made people stand up a little straighter when they saw me." Abigail blinked, surprised by this revelation, but she didn't interrupt. She could sense that it was difficult for Sandra to talk about, and she didn't want to break the flow. "I joined the military when I was just out of high school," Sandra continued. "I loved the uniform. I loved what it represented: strength, courage, service. I wanted to protect people, to make a difference." She smiled faintly, the memory almost bittersweet. "I was full of hope back then, young, eager to take on the world." Sandra paused for a moment, as if the weight of those memories was too much. "I served for over 20 years, she said finally. "I went to places I never imagined I'd go, some good, some bad. I saw things that still keep me up at night. War zones, conflict, loss. You never really come back from some of that." "Not completely." Abigail's expression softened with understanding. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected that the quiet janitor who cleaned the halls of her school had once been a soldier who had given so much for her country. "But it wasn't just the battles," Sandra continued, her voice growing heavier with emotion. "It was everything I had to give up along the way, my family, my friends. I lost them all, not because they died, but because they couldn't understand why I stayed. Every man I loved, every relationship I had, they wanted me to leave the military behind, but I couldn't. It was who I was." Sandra's eyes grew misty as she recalled the faces of those she'd left behind. People who had once meant the world to her, but were now just distant memories. "I lost the chance to have my own family, to have children, to build something for myself. And when I finally got injured, when a gunshot wound put me in the hospital for months, I realized that I had lost so much more than just friends. I had lost my life." The silence hung heavy between them. Abigail didn't know what to say, how to comfort this woman who had given so much. All she could do was listen. After my discharge, I tried to reintegrate back into civilian life, but it wasn't easy. The world had moved on without me, and I felt like a ghost in my own life, Sandra admitted. I took this job because it was all I could find. I never thought it would be like this, cleaning up after kids, who have no idea what it's like to serve, to sacrifice. Abigail felt a lump in her throat. She had always seen Sandra as just the janitor, but now she saw her as a person with a history, a past filled with courage and heartbreak. "You're more than that, though," Abigail said softly. "You're so much more than just a janitor. You're a hero." Sandra looked up at Abigail, startled by the girl's words. "A hero?" she repeated, disbelief coloring her tone. "Yes," Abigail insisted, her eyes shining with sincerity. "You've sacrificed so much for people like me. I'm sorry for everything you've gone through. You deserve so much more than this." The sincerity in Abigail's voice made Sandra's heart swell. She had never thought of herself in that light. But as Abigail spoke, a flicker of hope ignited within her. Perhaps she wasn't just a ghost in this world after all. "I appreciate that, Abigail," Sandra said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It means more to me than you know. I just wish I could find a way to reconnect with everything I lost." Abigail thought for a moment. "What if I help you?" she suggested, her mind racing with ideas. "We could do something together. I can help you find ways to reconnect with your passion, or maybe even volunteer somewhere. You deserve to share your story." Sandra blinked in surprise, unsure how to respond. She hadn't expected anyone, especially a student, to care enough to help her. But there was something about Abigail's enthusiasm that stirred something within her. Maybe a little bit of hope. "I'd like that," Sandra said finally, her voice trembling with emotion. "I'd like that a lot." From that day on, a beautiful friendship began to blossom between the two unlikely companions. Abigail became a source of light in Sandra's life, pushing her gently toward things she once loved. Together, they began to explore opportunities for Sandra to share her story, to give back to her community.